let's get started. I think, can you hear me okay, or is it pretty quiet? How's that? Okay, sounds good. So I hope you had a good experience with the midterm on Friday, and from here on out, we'll be applying some of those ecological and evolutionary principles from earlier in the course to this part of the course in plant fungal diversity. And if you were here last time, I gave a brief introduction to botany, or basically the study of botanical organisms that we're going to be involved in the rest of this semester, and gave a general overview of life and overall, looking at the prokaryotic world, the archaea and the bacteria. And we're not going to have a whole lot more to say about those organisms, even though they're hugely diverse and important for the rest of the semester, except for the cyanobacteria, the photosynthetic bacteria that have plant-like oxygen-producing photosynthesis, which are really important for thinking about the evolution of photosynthesis in eukaryotic organisms. All right, so we're going to launch right into the fungi today. And this is a really strange group of organisms, as you're probably aware, but probably not aware just quite how strange they are and how different they are from animals and plants. But that'll become clear as we go into their characteristics and some of these major groups and their life cycle, which is really distinctive. And you've probably been exposed to fungi mostly in your refrigerators and with your produce, that sort of thing, with various molds. Things like athlete's foot or ringworm, hopefully not, but I mean possibly some fungal diseases. And also from these fruiting bodies that we see out in nature, things that we commonly call mushrooms, and other kinds of fruiting bodies shown here from a diversity of different fungi. And up in the upper left, you can see some yeasts, which are also part of the fungi, and which are really important economically. So fungi are most commonly known as decomposers, recyclers of nutrients that otherwise would be unavailable to most organisms. And they share that role with the prokaryotes. So a lot of the bacteria, for example, are important decomposers or recyclers, making nutrients available ultimately to other organisms like plants and animals that otherwise would be tied up in forms that can't be utilized. So we really owe our existence to fungi as well as the prokaryotes in a number of different ways. It'll become more clear as we go on here. They also are important disease organisms, and we'll get into that more next time. Some of the more significant diseases that are important to humans are plant diseases. There's some major tree diseases that cause mass mortality of trees. For example, the chestnut blight back east, which basically wiped out the American chestnuts, which were one of the most common trees in eastern North American forests up until about the turn of the last century. And some of these fungal diseases can be very destructive to crops as well, and talk about some of those later. Fungal diseases of animals can be important. Of humans, most of them are fairly, you can classify them mostly as annoyances unless you have a compromised immune system. And in that case, fungal diseases are no joke and can be deadly. We'll talk about that more later. But also fungi, as you'll see today, are really important with regard to one of the most significant mutualisms in the living world. And without that mutualism, it's questionable whether we would be here. So that's something we'll get to shortly. All right, so just a list here of some major fungal characteristics that in part distinguish them from other organisms. They're all eukaryotes, and they accordingly have nuclei and mitochondria. But they don't have plastids, so there are no chloroplasts, for example, in fungi. And based on phylogenetic data and other evidence, it's pretty clear that they descend from ancestors that never had the ability to undergo photosynthesis. So these are strictly heterotrophic organisms. And their bodies are non-motile, so at maturity, they're typically unable to move freely, although they can spread out over a vast area as they grow. And that lack of motility, that lack of ability to move, is partly why they've been classified with plants historically. Those fungi that are multicellular are filamentous. That is, their bodies are made up of hyphae. Our singular form of that is hypha. These are basically very narrow tubular filaments that talk about more later, but they make up the fungal body called the mycelium overall. So mycelium is basically the overall fungal body, and the different elements of that fungal body are called hyphae. They have an absorptive mode of nutrition. And basically, they're similar to us in the sense that they're heterotrophs. That is, that they rely on organic compounds that have been created by other organisms. They can't photosynthesize, as we mentioned. They're not autotrophs of any kind. But they have a different way of taking in their food. So unlike us, we actually, of course, ingest our food or engulf our food. They actually penetrate their food. They come into physical contact with their food and absorb it. So they are producing, for example, hydrolytic enzymes that are breaking down organic polymers into smaller monomers and absorbing those into their tissues. So fungi are basically penetrating the food source. And that filamentous form is really important in that. We'll get to that again in a moment. So they do have cell walls, and that's another reason that they were thought to be closely related to plants at one time, because plants also have cell walls. Animals do not have cell walls. We have cell membranes, but we don't have cell walls outside those. The cell walls impart rigidity to the cell, give it some additional structural support, but it also means you can't move around very easily. It creates some limitations, but it's important for the structure of fungi as it is in plants. Their cell walls may appear similar superficially to those of plants, but in fact they're not made of the same type of substance. So the cell walls of plants are made up of cellulose, whereas the cell walls of fungi are made up of chitin, which is another polymer that, in this case, is similar to, it's a case of convergent evolution with arthropods like insects, spiders, and crustaceans, that also their exoskeletons are made up of the exact same substance, chitin, and it serves a structural role there as well, but it's an independent evolution of that same compound. But a case of homology, or common ancestry with regard to a particular characteristic, is that fungi store their carbon, so their storage form of their food is glycogen, and that's shared with animals. So you and I, we also store our energy in the form of glycogen in our bodies. Glycogen's often been called animal starch. It serves a similar role as starch does in true plants. So this is a difference from plants and a similarity with us that the fungi share, probably due to common ancestry. As I mentioned last time, the fungi are much more closely related to animals than they are to any photosynthetic organism, including plants, even though they've been historically considered plants. So really, if we were going to be fair about this in upper division classes, fungi would be treated in zoology classes rather than botany classes, but it's a historical artifact that we cover them in botany. And another thing about fungi, this is shared with plants, is that they part of their reproductive life cycle involves spores. So a spore is a unicellular reproductive structure that germinates directly to produce a new life form, a new organism. So this is in contrast to gametes. like sperm and egg, that are also unicellular reproductive bodies, but they have to fuse with another gamete in order to form a new organism, whereas a spore germinates directly to form a new organism. So that's the fundamental distinction between a spore and a gamete, and we'll see this again over and over again. And all fungi come in both unicellular and multicellular taxa species, although the majority of the described species of fungi by far are multicellular organisms. But as I mentioned last time, fungi evolved multicellularity independently from the animals. They descend from common ancestor, but that common ancestor was unicellular. So there's a similar, both land plants, fungi, and animals, all multicellular organisms, all descended from distinct unicellular life forms. All right, so here's a cartoon that shows a longitudinal section through a fruiting body of a mushroom and into the soil to make the point that most of the fungal body that's visible to us in nature are these fruiting bodies, which really constitute just a small fraction of the overall biomass of the mycelium of the fungal body. As I mentioned already, fungi have an absorptive mode of nutrition. This means that, as I said, they have to penetrate their food source, so most of the fungal body is involved in harvesting energy underground or within the substrate, and so it's invisible to us. An exception to this are molds. Mold is an ecological term. It's not a taxonomic term. There are a lot of different groups that produce molds within the fungi, and even some things that aren't fungi that produce molds. A mold is basically anything that produces hyphae that are outside the substrate. So the furry-looking covering that some fungi produce on bread and produce, those are called molds because the filaments, these hyphae, are actually outside the substrate. We can see them, but most of the fungus is usually within the substrate, and we can't see it. It's invisible. And only when they go to reproduce do most fungi typically produce something that we can see. And a good reason for this is because if you want to disperse your spores, which are what are being dispersed from these fruiting bodies, it's a good idea to get them up into the atmosphere where the spores can be carried away. You don't want to be competing with your own progeny and having your spores dispersed right on top of you. That's a pretty negative outcome for everyone in the family. So that's the evolutionary significance of these things. So the hyphae, mostly underground or within whatever the substrate happens to be. And there at the lower right, you can see some magnification, especially at the far right, of some fungal hyphae within a mycelium that's invaded that straw there. And so you can see these hyphae are tiny, they're microscopic. They grow in length and they branch extensively, but they don't grow in girth. They're very narrow. And this means that fungi can have an extensive network of these hyphae within their food source. And for example, if you were to take a cubic centimeter of soil, just a very small amount of soil that is impregnated with hyphae from a fungus, and lay those fungal hyphae out end to end, just that small amount of soil would stretch out about 1 kilometer. So they can have a huge amount of filaments surface area in contact with a small amount of soil. So they have a very high surface to volume ratio. And this is a really important thing for a fungus to be able to contact as much of their food source as possible. The downside for them ecologically is that if you have a very high surface to volume ratio, it also means that you're going to be prone to desiccation or drying out. And so we do typically find fungi in moisture environments. Although we can get into some dry environments, the periods of activity are going to be limited to wetter times. So this is a sort of double-edged sword for the fungi in terms of both benefits and liabilities. So another thing about these fungal filaments is they can grow pretty quickly. And I'll show you partly why that's possible in a moment. But they can invade a new food source really quickly and mobilize hyphal growth in particular parts of the mycelium if something dies or they run into some rich food source. But another thing is that they can also quickly form a fruiting body if conditions are right. So what are those conditions? For example, if under moist conditions, that would be a pretty favorable time to produce hyphae that are going to be in contact with the atmosphere, because they could otherwise desiccate quite a bit, especially if they're projected out into the air. Also, if they start to run short of food, it might be a good strategy to reproduce just in case you don't make it. At least you'll have reproduced and your lineage will continue. So those are some of the evolutionary arguments that might go behind why they happen to produce these fungal bodies quickly. But they also, even though a mushroom is a fairly solid object, there's a lot of empty airspace within a fruiting body of a fungus typically, at least in the ones that grow really, really quickly. There are some shelf fungi that grow, for example, on decaying logs that can be really solid, but those grow very slowly and over the course of years oftentimes. But here you can see up in the upper right, I'm going to show you a little time lapse of some fungal fruiting bodies forming over the course of just a few hours. So the one there on the left, that one on the right's already gone. And you can see it opening up, and then it'll be releasing up to about 1 billion spores into the environment that then can be rafted away by air currents. So these fungal fruiting bodies can form huge numbers of spores. These are sexual spores. We'll get to that later. So these are progeny that have distinct genotypes from the parent. And some of these, you may be seeing puffballs before in nature. And I don't know if you've ever, they're sort of solid fruiting body. When you, if they're mature and you hit them, you can see these clouds of spores come up. Those can form over 1 trillion spores in individual fruiting body. So fungi can really reproduce pretty significantly. They can produce huge numbers of spores in a given fruiting body. All right, so here's part of the reason why fungi can mobilize resources quickly in different parts of the mycelium. And that is that to some extent at least, the interior of those filaments, those hyphae, are open. They have open channels for moving cytoplasm around inside these filaments. So on the right side there, you see what we call a cenocytic hypha. That's found in certain, so these two types of hypha shown here are found in different major groups of fungi. These are not forms of hyphae we get in the same species. These are different types of hyphae we see in different distantly related species. Okay, so on the right side, you can see an open hypha there that's branching, and you can see those blue nuclei floating around in there. So this is completely open inside. It's not broken into cellular compartments. The nuclei are freely moving around. And even on the left there, these septate hyphae, which we find in some of the so-called higher fungi, where we have these partitions breaking up the hypha into multiple compartments, each one of these compartments having 1 or sometimes 2 nuclei. This is these partitions, as you can probably see, maybe not from the back of the room, they have an open center. So cytoplasm can move right through the center of these septae, and it's pretty easy for these fungi to move cytoplasm wholesale from one part of the mycelium to the other. It's something very unusual in all organisms to have this kind of open movement of cytoplasm, although we'll talk about some really cool organisms shortly that aren't fungi that do that too. All right, so one type of life mode that I didn't mention about fungi is that fungi are incredibly diverse. There are about over 100,000 species that have been described, and there's probably 15 times that many that await description. So they're vastly underrepresented in the taxonomy, but there's a lot of diversity out there. And we even have some carnivorous fungi that actually are predatory. And that's maybe something you haven't heard about because it's not too common, although there's some diversity across different major groups of fungi that have evolved ways of trapping animals. Some of them have sticky traps that trap small organisms. And this is a particularly cool example here. This is an ascomycete. We'll talk about the higher fungus that produces little constriction rings of hyphae that hapless nematodes can wander through. And then when they touch the inside of that ring of hyphae, it can constrict within like a tenth of a second and lasso the nematode, and then it'll digest the nematode. And so I'll show you here a time lapse. This isn't a time lapse. This is real time of a nematode getting trapped by one of these lasso-forming ascomycetes. So there he is. He's just going in right now, and it's constricted around the nematode. It's struggling to get away. So that's the kind of thing that some of these fungi are capable of, although this is a pretty rare evolutionary innovation. So at the other end of the spectrum, from carnivory, which is obviously deleterious to the organism, the other organism involved, there's mutualism. So in the ecology section of the course, you no doubt heard about symbioses. A symbiosis is any kind of intimate association, physical association between organisms of different species, whether it be deleterious to one or beneficial to one, or deleterious or beneficial to both. A mutualism is beneficial to both members of the symbiosis. And fungi are involved in many of these mutualisms with other and often distantly related groups of organisms. We'll talk about some other examples later, but arguably the most significant for life on Earth is the one that's formed between plant roots and fungi. And this is what we call a mycorrhizal association. So mycorrhizae literally means fungus root. And that's a great name for it because the fungus is intimately associated with the root of the plant. And you can see in this cartoon the fungal hypha above there that has direct contact with these root cells below from a vascular plant. And this intimate association results in a benefit to both parties. The fungus gets out of this organic compounds from the plant. So the plant's providing the fungus with carbohydrates, amino acids, and the plant is getting out of this more efficient absorption of nutrients from the soil, especially phosphates, phosphorus compounds, which can be limiting. It's a macronutrient of plants that is often limiting in soils. So the fungus is also getting some benefit, the plant is also getting some benefit from enhanced absorption of water as well. So the fungus is better at absorbing things from the soil, but it can't photosynthesize. The plant, of course, can photosynthesize, and it can transport those photosynthates to the roots, which need photosynthate in order to survive anyways, and transfer that to the fungus. And the important point here is if you separate the two, if you don't allow the association to occur, it's clearly to the detriment of the plant and evidently detriment to the fungus as well. So neither partner does as well without the other, which is sort of the acid test for mutualisms. And we'll get more to it a little bit later. In fact, actually, we're going to get into it a little bit more right now, because there are two major types of these mycorrhizal associations that are super important ecologically. So one of them is called ectomycorrhizal association. And there are particular fungal groups, especially the higher fungi, the ones that produce large fruiting bodies, that are involved in these ectomycorrhizal associations with plants. And the plants involved in these associations are woody plants, so especially temperate or boreal trees. So things like members of the pine family or spruce family, that is raised conifers, and also hardwoods, so things like beeches, birches, walnuts, even eucalyptus. Some of these large trees of typically non-tropical situations have this kind of association. So in this instance, the reason it's called ectomycorrhizal is because the fungi are growing on the outside of the root. That's not completely true in the sense that, as you can see on the right, the fungus is shown in dark brown and the plant roots are in lighter brown there. The fungal hyphae are forming a dense mantle or covering around the root, increasing its girth. They're also penetrating the intercellular spaces, between the cells of the root into the cortex. They're going through the epidermis into the cortex of the root, but they're not actually penetrating any cell walls of the plant roots. So they're going in between the cells of the plant root, but not into the cells, and that's why they're called ectomycorrhizae. So these are really important associations for the fitness of these trees. The other type of mycorrhizal association is one that is involved with over 90% of land plants. So this is really an important association. This is almost ubiquitous across the plants. And this is involving a group of fungi I'll introduce in a moment, a special group, a kingdom or phylum, not a kingdom, a phylum or division of fungi that are called the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And there's a good reason for that name. These are fungi that are not forming a mantle around the roots as a whole, so you don't really see them. If you look at the roots under hand lens, you don't make out the presence of these fungi. They're penetrating through these root hairs on a plant root. And they're going, like the other fungi, they can go through the intercellular spaces between the cells of the plant root, but ultimately